The mountain man hadn't touched another human being in 15 years. Not a handshake, not a brush of shoulders, nothing. So when her voice, crisp and clear like an autumn morning, cut through the biting Utah air, his axe froze mid-swing. "Hello?" It hung there, a silver crescent against the gray sky, as he stood over the chopping block. He was a ghost on this mountain, a whisper in the town of Cedar Ridge below. They called him Thatcher Kane, the educated man who went mad, the hermit who spoke to ghosts. They said he was cursed, a broken soul who would die alone on his peak, surrounded by nothing but ice and silence. They had no idea how wrong they were. Miles away from him, a woman stepped down from a rattling stagecoach, clutching a marriage contract in her gloved hands. The name on the paper, she believed, was her salvation. She thought she was escaping a desperate flight from her past, a false accusation that had chased her across the continent. She had no idea she had just walked from one trap into another, something far more sinister than she could ever imagine. And this silent man on the mountain, this broken hermit haunted by a deadly accident, was the only one standing in the way. But he carried a guilt so heavy it had silenced him for over a decade. When these two souls, both running from their pasts, collided by a twist of fate, it wasn't just a storm that began to brew over the Utah peaks. It was a fire that would either forge them into something unbreakable or burn them both to ash. The axe bit deep into the pine log, splitting it with a clean, satisfying crack. Thatcher Kane wiped a line of sweat from his brow, though the March cold nipped at his exposed forearms. 15 years. 15 years of this same routine. Chop wood, haul water, check the snares. 15 years where the only sounds were the wind howling through the rocky peaks and the steady rhythmic thud of his own labor. He wasn't always this man. He was Professor Thatcher Kane once, a man of books and law, a man with a brilliant mind and a future that stretched out like a sunlit road. That was before the accident, before the wagon wheel snagged on a treacherous outcrop on the mountain pass, sending them tumbling into the ravine below. Before his pregnant wife, Sarah, bled out in his arms, her life slipping away into the cold, unforgiving snow while he lay helpless beside her. The people of Cedar Ridge still whispered his story, the professor who snapped, the hermit who'd rather talk to the wind than another person. They crossed themselves when his name was spoken aloud, convinced he was touched by madness, or worse, cursed by some dark mountain spirit. Sheriff Clayton, the law down in town, made sure those stories stayed dark and scary. It was better for everyone if folks feared the mountain. Better they didn't come poking around, discovering Thatcher wasn't a monster, just a man shattered by grief. Clayton had his own reasons for wanting to keep people away from the high country. Thatcher heaved another log onto the block. The repetitive motion was a balm to his racing mind, the way teaching complex legal theory once had been. Mathematics, literature, philosophy, all of it useless now. His world was wood and stone, and the crushing, endless quiet. Then he heard it, a sound so alien it made him freeze, every muscle in his body going rigid, the distinct rattle and crunch of wagon wheels on the rocky trail. Nobody ever came up here, ever. A battered stagecoach, looking like it had barely survived the journey, rounded the final bend. The driver looked spooked, his eyes darting around as he guided his tired horses toward the small, neat cabin. Thatcher dropped his axe. He melted back into the deep shadows of the barn, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was wrong, all wrong. The coach door creaked open. A woman stepped out, and Thatcher Kane forgot how to breathe. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, the color of a twilight sky. Her skin was the rich color of dark earth, smooth and unlined, despite what must have been a grueling journey. Everything about her screamed of education, of refinement, of a world he had abandoned 15 years ago. She clutched a small leather satchel in one hand and a sheaf of official-looking papers in the other. She was, without question, the most beautiful thing he had seen since Sarah. The driver, anxious to be gone, tossed a heavy trunk to the ground and scrambled back onto his seat without a word. "This is as far as I go, miss," he called down, his voice tight with nerves. "Kane's place, just like you asked." Then he cracked his whip, and the stagecoach lurched away, disappearing down the trail, leaving only a cloud of dust and an even deeper silence. Kane. The name echoed in Thatcher's mind. Thomas Kane. The greasy, cruel shopkeeper down in town. The man who ordered his supplies through the mail service. The man who happened to share Thatcher's last name. It was a mistake. A terrible, dangerous mistake. The woman smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt. She walked toward his cabin door with a confidence that made Thatcher's chest feel tight, like a fist was squeezing his heart. When was the last time someone had knocked on that door? He couldn't remember. She knocked. Two sharp, decisive raps. "Hello? Mr. Kane?" Her voice was even more striking than he'd imagined. It carried the crisp, precise consonants of a Boston education. Thatcher's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He hadn't spoken a word to another human being in more than 2 years. The muscles felt rusted shut. "Mr. Thomas Kane?" She called again, her voice a little louder. "I'm Eliza Mayfield, your bride." The words hit him like a physical blow. A mail-order bride. For Thomas Kane. A man known for his cruelty. A man who treated anyone he considered beneath him like dirt on his shoe. Especially someone who looked like this woman. The townsfolk were already hostile enough. A black woman, alone, arriving to marry a man like Thomas Kane? It was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. She knocked again, harder this time, with a hint of impatience. "I know you're in there. I can see the smoke from your chimney." His hands were shaking. He had to do something. He couldn't just hide in the barn like a coward. He took a breath and stepped out from the shadows. She turned at the sound of his boots crunching on the packed earth. Her dark eyes widened for a fraction of a second, taking him in. But she didn't scream. She didn't retreat. She just stood her ground watching him. "You're not Thomas Kane," she said. It wasn't a question. He tried to speak, to explain, but all that came out was a rough, dry croak, the sound of a voice long unused. Her gaze was unnervingly intelligent. She studied his face, taking in the worn leather of his clothes, the untrimmed beard that hid the lines of grief around his mouth, the heavy calluses on his hands. But she also saw the neat, well-maintained cabin behind him, the carefully stacked firewood, the orderly tools. Then her eyes fell on the porch rail, where he'd left a book open to the morning sun. "You can read," she stated, nodding toward it. "Marcus Aurelius, in the original Latin." He finally found his voice. It was hoarse, but it was his. "You're in the wrong place. The driver said this was Kane's property." "I'm Thatcher Kane. Thomas lives in town." She pulled the contract from her satchel and read it again, her brow furrowed in concentration. The correspondence was very specific. T. Kane, mountain property, Cedar Ridge territory. "A mistake," he said. "A rather expensive one," she murmured, looking back down the empty road where the stagecoach had vanished. "I spent my last dollar on that ticket." As she spoke, the sky above them began to change. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in over the peaks, swallowing the afternoon sun. Thatcher knew the signs. He could feel the pressure dropping, could smell the snow on the wind. A bad one was coming. "Storm's moving in," he said, his voice rough. "You need to get to town." "How far is it?" "5 miles, all downhill." She looked at the threatening sky, then back at him. "Too far to walk in what's coming." She squared her shoulders, a decision made. "Then I suppose I'm staying here for the night." Every single instinct he possessed screamed at him to say no, to send her away. He had built this fortress of solitude to protect himself. He couldn't handle company, couldn't bear the questions, the conversation, the simple, overwhelming presence of another breathing soul in his carefully controlled world. But the alternative was to let her walk down that mountain and freeze to death. He couldn't do that. Not again. One night, he managed to choke out. She smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and the expression transformed her entire face. It was a flash of warmth and light that pierced through 15 years of gloom, making his forgotten heart give a painful, unfamiliar lurch in his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Thatcher Kane," she said. She bent down, lifted her heavy trunk with a surprising strength, and walked right past him toward his cabin door, as if she belonged there. as if fate hadn't just made a catastrophic error, delivering the wrong woman to a man who had long ago given up on living. The first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, as she disappeared inside his sanctuary. Thatcher stood frozen in the yard, his breath pluming in the suddenly frigid air. 15 years of absolute unbroken silence, shattered by a stranger's smile. The storm was going to be much, much worse than he thought. The blizzard hit with a feral fury only the high mountains could conjure. Snow didn't fall, it attacked. It came down in thick, blinding sheets of white, turning the middle of the day into a dim, ghostly twilight. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and clawing at the cabin walls. Thatcher sat rigid in his worn armchair by the fire, every nerve ending alight. He was hyper-aware of every single sound Eliza made as she moved about his small sanctuary. The soft rustle of her dress, the quiet click of a cup being set down on the table, the way she ran her fingers along the spines of his books, a gesture of obvious, ravenous hunger. Philosophy, literature, legal texts, mathematics, she said, her voice soft in the firelit room. This is the collection of a scholar, not a hermit. She turned to him. You were a teacher. Again, not a question. A statement of fact. Once, he grunted, staring into the flames. What happened? The question hung in the air between them. He could feel the weight of 15 years of unspoken grief pressing down on him. Life, was all he said. She didn't press him. To his immense relief, she let it go. Instead, she pulled a slim volume of poetry from the shelf and settled into Sarah's old rocking chair on the other side of the hearth. The sight of her sitting there, in that specific chair, sent a shard of ice through his veins. No one had sat there since before. He wanted to scream at her to get up, to get out, but the words were locked in his throat. He just sat there, a statue of a man, watching her read by the flickering firelight as the storm raged outside. By morning, the world was gone. 3 feet of dense, heavy snow blocked the door, sealing them inside. Thatcher had to put his shoulder to it, forcing it open just enough to peer out into a landscape transformed. The entire world was a sea of silent, pristine white. The road down the mountain, their only connection to civilization, had completely vanished. How long? Eliza asked from just behind him. Her voice was steady, without a trace of panic. 3 days or not, he said. Maybe 4, if it stops now. She absorbed this news with a quiet nod. No tears, no complaints. Instead, she found an old pair of his wife's work gloves and rolled up the sleeves of her fine wool dress. She helped him dig a path to the barn, her soft, city hands blistering within the first hour. She never once mentioned the pain. The second day brought visitors. The thundering sound of hoofbeats muffled by the deep snow reached them first. It was an impossible sound. Thatcher grabbed the rifle he always kept loaded by the door and peered through a crack in the window shutters. 6 mounted men were picking their way through the deep drifts in his clearing. At their head rode Sheriff Clayton, his face a grim mask beneath the wide brim of his hat. Thatcher Kane! Clayton's voice boomed across the snow-covered yard, sharp and ugly. We know you got her up there. Eliza appeared at his shoulder, her face suddenly pale. She recognized the raw hostility in their posture, the way their hands rested near their holstered pistols. What do they want? She whispered. Thatcher's mind raced. In 15 years, not a single lawman had ever bothered with the strenuous ride up to his cabin. Not once. Now, here were 6 of them, armed and looking for a fight. Something was terribly wrong. Open up, Kane, Clayton shouted again. We're looking for a runaway, a colored woman. Stole a great deal of money from her employer back east. Eliza sucked in a sharp, wounded breath beside him. I never stole anything in my life. Thatcher looked at her face. He was a lawyer, trained to read people, to see the truth or the lie in their eyes. He saw truth in hers, but he also saw an old, deep-seated fear. Someone, somewhere, had hurt this woman badly. Badly enough to make her flee across half a continent with nothing but a fraudulent marriage contract. She's been accused, Clayton yelled, his voice laced with impatience. Her intended, Thomas Kane, wants his property back. Property. The word landed on Thatcher like a punch to the gut. He'd heard that tone before, in dusty courtrooms and shadowed back alleys. The casual, cruel dehumanization that turns a person into a thing, an object to be owned and reclaimed. "What are you going to do?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling now. Thatcher looked at her. He saw the way she stood, straight-backed and proud, despite the terror in her eyes. He thought of the blisters on her hands, the way she had worked beside him without a word of complaint. He looked at the books she had so carefully, so respectfully, replaced on his shelves. He had spent 15 years running from the world, hiding from life. But some part of him, the part he thought he had buried with Sarah, the part that had always fought for justice, began to stir. He took a deep breath, unlatched the heavy bar, and opened the door. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and even. Clayton's eyes widened in genuine surprise. He was clearly expecting a wild-eyed, raving madman. Instead, the legendary mountain hermit looked normal, clean, articulate, sane. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff muttered. "Didn't expect to see you talking to folks, Kane. Heard you gone completely wild up here." "Rumors tend to grow in small towns," Thatcher replied coolly. "We're tracking a fugitive," Clayton said, getting back to business. "Runaway, bound for Thomas Kane. You seen anything?" Thatcher's long-dormant legal training kicked into high gear. Rule 1, never volunteer information. Rule 2, never lie outright if you can avoid it. Rule 3, control the narrative. "Define fugitive," Thatcher said. Clayton shifted in his saddle, annoyed. "Colored woman, tall, well-dressed, probably looks scared." Thatcher let a moment of silence pass. "I hired some help 3 days ago," he said, the lie forming smoothly on his tongue. "Woman needed work. The storm hit before she could head back down to town." The words felt strange and powerful in his mouth. He felt something unlocked deep in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 15 years. Clayton's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. "Help? Help doing what? I thought you liked your solitude. Cooking, cleaning, tasks that need doing." "We'll need to question her," the sheriff insisted. "She's working right now." "This ain't a request, Kane." Thatcher took a deliberate step out onto his porch, the rifle held loosely, casually, in the crook of his arm. 15 years of splitting wood and hauling rock had kept him strong, and the weapon in his hands carried an easy, unspoken authority. "This is my property, Sheriff," he said, his voice dropping low. "She is my employee. You want to talk to her, you come back with a warrant. Until then, you talk to me." The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind. Clayton was clearly baffled. This was not the broken, crazy hermit of local legend. This was someone else entirely. Behind him in the doorway, Thatcher could feel Eliza's presence like a warm shield at his back. "Thomas Kane has legal papers," Clayton finally snarled, trying to regain control. "Then Thomas Kane can present them to a territorial judge," Thatcher countered. "Until he does, my hired help stays hired." Clayton spat a stream of tobacco juice into the pure white snow. It was a dark, ugly stain on the landscape. "This ain't over, Kane." "Didn't expect it would be," Thatcher said. The sheriff wheeled his horse around, his face a thundercloud of fury, and led his men back down the mountain path, their retreat clumsy and angry. Thatcher stood on the porch and watched until they were completely gone, swallowed by the endless white. "Why?" Eliza asked from the doorway, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Thatcher turned and looked at her. He really looked at her, past the fear and the exhaustion of her journey. He saw the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, the unshakable strength in the set of her shoulders, the quiet dignity she wore like a suit of armor. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, and he was shocked to realize he meant it. That evening she cooked for him. It was the first real meal he'd eaten in years, not just sustenance shoveled down out of necessity. It was stew, rich with preserved vegetables and dried meat, and freshly baked bread that filled the small cabin with a scent he hadn't smelled since Sarah was alive. They sat across from each other at his small, handmade table. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't strained or empty. It was comfortable, companionable. "I was a lawyer," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. He hadn't told anyone that in 15 years. She didn't look surprised. I worked for lawyers in Boston. A shadow passed over her face. Before, before what happened there, he asked gently. Someone needed a scapegoat for a theft that never happened, she said, her voice tight. I was educated, I was new, I was convenient. Thatcher nodded slowly. He understood scapegoats. He understood blame and guilt and the crushing weight of things that were beyond your control. The woman you lost, Eliza said, her voice soft as falling snow. Your wife. He flinched, but he didn't shut down. For the first time, he found he could speak her name. Sarah. We were coming back from town. The wagon wheel, it caught wrong on the pass. She was pregnant with our first child. I'm so sorry, Thatcher. I was driving. The confession hung between them, a three-word summary of 15 years of self-imposed exile and punishment. He had carried that guilt alone for so long, a poison in his soul. Now saying it out loud to this woman who understood what it meant to run from the past, it felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song around the eaves of the cabin. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, two broken souls sat in the quiet, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's company. Neither of them mentioned that the blizzard was supposed to end the next day. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them wanted it to. The storm broke on the fourth day. It left the world reborn, scoured clean and glittering under a painfully bright sun. Thatcher stood in his doorway, breathing in air so cold and pure, it felt like it was burning his lungs. And for the first time in 15 years, the thought of being alone again filled him with a profound sense of dread. Eliza packed her few belongings with a quiet, heartbreaking efficiency. Neither of them spoke of the shared meals, of the long conversations by the fire, of the way it had started to feel so natural, so right, to move around each other in the small, confined space of the cabin. That story, she said finally, breaking the silence. The hired help story. You'll have to maintain it if I'm going to stay in the area. His head snapped up. You're staying? A small, wry smile touched her lips. Where else would I go? I have no money, no prospects, and a fraudulent marriage contract for a man who seems to want me arrested. Cedar Ridge is as good a place as any to start over. Relief washed through him, so potent it made him dizzy. It was followed immediately by a surge of pure terror. Keeping her here meant maintaining the lie. It meant trips to town. It meant interacting with people. It meant shattering the 15 years of protective isolation he had so carefully constructed. I'll need supplies anyway, he heard himself say. The ride down the mountain was like descending into a foreign country. After years of near total silence, the noise and bustle of Cedar Ridge was a physical assault on his senses. He tied his horse outside the general store and felt every eye on the street lock onto him. He was a ghost walking in daylight. Old Pete Morrison, who ran the smithy, literally dropped his hammer. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed. Thatcher Kane, in the flesh. Pete, I heard you was dead, or crazy, or both. Still breathing, Thatcher replied, his voice still rough from disuse. Inside the store, all conversation died. The air grew thick with whispers as he moved between the shelves. He selected flour, beans, coffee, salt, the basics. But he bought twice as much as usual. Enough for two people. That's a whole lot of food for a hermit, commented Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, her voice dripping with suspicion. Hired some help, Thatcher said, the lie coming more easily this time. The words spread through the store like a lit match on dry tinder. By evening, half the town would know the Mad Mountain Man had come down from his peak. By morning, they'd all think they knew why. When he returned to the cabin, Eliza was waiting. She had his wife's old legal texts spread across the table, alongside her own marriage contract. She had been studying it with the focused, intense concentration of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. There's something deeply wrong with these papers, she said, not even looking up as he entered. Thatcher came and stood over her shoulder. His own legal training, though rusty, kicked in immediately. He saw what she saw. The irregularities were glaring. The witnessing signatures, he pointed out. They're identical. Same hand, just different names scribbled. Exactly, she said, her finger tracing a line of dense text. And look at this clause about debt transfer. It stipulates that if I fail to fulfill the marriage contract for any reason, I owe my benefactor compensation equal to my travel expenses, plus penalties. Indentured servitude, he breathed. It was a trap, designed to look legal. But here's the strangest part, she continued, pushing a letter across the table. This is the original letter I received, the one that convinced me to come. Compare Thomas Kane's signature on it to his signature on the contract. Thatcher studied both documents. The handwriting was completely different. Two different people signed these, he said, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Which means Thomas Kane didn't write to you. Someone else did. Someone is using his name to run this operation. A sharp knock on the door made them both jump. It was Doc Ida Walker. Her face was as weathered as the mountains themselves, creased with a lifetime of worry and wisdom. She was Cedar Ridge's doctor, midwife, and unofficial conscience. The only person in town who treated everyone the same, regardless of their station or the color of their skin. Heard you got company up here, Thatcher, she said, her sharp eyes bypassing him and fixing on Eliza. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Child, she said to Eliza, her voice surprisingly gentle. You in some kind of trouble? Nothing I can't handle, Eliza replied, her chin high. Mm-hmm. That's what they all say right before the sky falls on their heads. Ida settled into the rocking chair as if she owned it. Been hearing stories down in town. Stories about runaway brides and stolen money and all sorts of ugly nonsense. Just hired help, Thatcher repeated his well-rehearsed line. Ida's eyes twinkled. Of course she is. And I'm the Queen of England. But I didn't climb all the way up here to pry into your business, Thatcher. I came to warn you. Her expression turned serious. Thomas Kane has been stirring up trouble, ranting in his store about his rights, his property, and how the law needs to step in and fetch what's his. What kind of trouble? Eliza asked. The kind that gets people hurt, Ida said grimly. And Sheriff Clayton seems awfully interested in his complaints. More interested than a simple mail-order bride mix-up would warrant. Eliza and Thatcher exchanged a look. Clayton's immediate aggressive hostility suddenly made a lot more sense. Now there's something else, Ida continued, leaning forward. Thomas Kane ain't the first man in this territory to order himself a wife through the mail. There's been a steady stream of them over the past 2 years. Thatcher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How many? A dozen, maybe more. All arranged through the same service. All of them young women, desperate, with no family nearby to check on them. What happened to them? Eliza whispered. That's the thing, Ida said, her voice dropping. Most of them just disappeared after a few months. Folks assumed they moved on, couldn't take the rough life out here. But I got to wondering, young women all alone, with nowhere to go. It makes a person terribly vulnerable. The ugly implications of her words hung in the cabin air, like thick smoke. Thatcher felt his old prosecutorial instincts, buried for 15 years under a mountain of grief, begin to stir. The hunger for justice, the need to uncover the truth. You think it's organized? He asked. I think there are folks in this territory getting rich off of human misery, Doc Ida said, her eyes hard as stone. And I think your young lady here, by sheer accident, just stumbled right into the middle of it. That night after Ida left, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was the quiet of two minds working on the same puzzle, the silence of a shared, looming danger. To keep their hands busy, Eliza helped Thatcher organize his late wife's papers. Sarah had also been a teacher, and her meticulous lesson plans and student records revealed a sharp, methodical mind that mirrored his own. She would have liked you, Thatcher said, the words slipping out, quiet and true. Eliza looked up from a stack of faded essays. How can you know that? She believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The same way you stood up to Clayton's posse just by being here. The same way you're trying to figure this out instead of just running. You fought for me, she corrected him softly. No, he said, meeting her gaze across the table. We fought for each other. The simple truth of it landed between them, solid and real. It felt like a bridge, spanning the 15 years of his isolation and the thousands of miles of her desperate journey. Outside, a lone coyote called across the valley, its voice wild and untamed. But inside the cabin, two people who had both lost everything were beginning to see the first glimmer of what they might be able to build together. "Tomorrow," Thatcher announced, his voice firm, "I'm going back to town. I need to ask more questions." "We go back to town," Eliza stated. "It's too dangerous for you." "It's more dangerous if you go alone," she countered, her logic unassailable. "I know what to look for in legal documents. You know how to talk to people, how to ask the right questions without raising suspicion." She held out her hand. "Partnership." He looked at her hand, then back at her face. "Partnership." He took her hand. The contact was like a jolt of lightning, a sudden, shocking reminder of what it felt like to connect with another person. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had arrived by a cosmic mistake, and turned his entire world upside down. She was smart, she was brave, and she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with her unyielding character. And for the first time in 15 years, Thatcher Kane actually looked forward to tomorrow. 3 days later, Doc Ida returned. She wasn't alone. The man with her was tall and weathered, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much of the world's ugliness to be surprised by anything. He wore a simple traveler's coat, but pinned to the inside was the unmistakable glint of a federal marshal's badge. "Marshal Frank Davies," he introduced himself, his voice a low, no-nonsense rumble. "Been investigating complaints about irregular mail-order bride operations in this territory for the better part of a year. Your situation, Ms. Mayfield, fits a pattern we've been tracking." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was all business. Eliza spread her fraudulent contract on the table. Davies produced two others from a leather satchel, laying them side by side. The similarities were chillingly precise. "Same witnessing signatures on all three documents," Thatcher observed, his lawyer's eye missing nothing. "Same debt clauses, designed to be impossible to repay," Eliza added, her finger tracing the predatory language. "Same impossible penalty structure," Davies finished, his mouth set in a grim line. "We've documented 17 cases just like this across 4 territories. Women arrive expecting a new life and find themselves trapped in debt slavery instead." "What happened to the other women?" Eliza asked, her voice tight. "Some managed to escape and contact us. Some didn't. We're still actively looking for 6 who have vanished entirely." The weight of that statement settled over the small cabin like a funeral shroud. Eliza's hand trembled slightly as she touched the forged signature on her own contract. She could have been one of them. "Thomas Kane isn't the mastermind," Davies continued. "He's a local coordinator. An operation this large, this organized, needs local law enforcement to look the other way. It needs official-looking paperwork to be processed without anyone asking inconvenient questions." "Sheriff Clayton," Thatcher said, the pieces clicking into place. "That's our working theory," Davies confirmed. "We've been building a case against him for 8 months, but it's all circumstantial. We need hard evidence. We need someone on the inside, someone the targets would trust." His eyes settled on Eliza. A cold dread washed over Thatcher. "You want her to go back to Thomas Kane?" "Not exactly," the marshal said. "We want you to pretend to comply. Go to him, claim you're ready to honor the contract, make him think he's won. While you're there, you'll be our eyes and ears. We need to document everything." Thatcher stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice a low growl. "I will not put her in that kind of danger." "I can handle myself, Thatcher," Eliza said quietly, though her eyes were wide. "Against men who make women disappear?" he shot back. "Against men who underestimate educated women," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "Thomas Kane thinks he owns me. He thinks I'm desperate and helpless. That will make him careless." Davies pulled a small, heavy leather pouch from his coat. "The United States Marshals Service has resources. We'll have agents nearby. We'll have safe houses. We can offer protection. But what we need, what those 17 women need, is evidence that will stand up in a territorial court." "What kind of evidence?" Thatcher asked, his mind already working through legal strategies. "Financial records, correspondence, ledgers, Anything that proves Sheriff Clayton's direct involvement. The kind of documents that only someone with legal training could properly identify, preserve, and authenticate. This time, Davy's gaze shifted to Thatcher. You know about my background, Thatcher stated. Former territorial prosecutor, highly respected, retired from public life after a personal tragedy, Davies recited. The perfect cover story for a reclusive mountain man who decides to help a federal investigation into corruption in the local justice system. The trap was laid, and it was brilliant. And if something goes wrong, Thatcher asked, his voice tight, then 17 women and counting never get justice, Davies said, his voice flat and hard. And this cancer continues to spread to new territories, destroying more lives. Eliza walked to the window and looked down at Cedar Ridge. From this high up, the town looked peaceful, idyllic in the afternoon sun. A picture of ordinary life. But they knew it was a lie. Evil was flourishing in its shadows, hidden in plain sight. I have to try, she said finally, turning back to face them. Her voice was steady, resolved. Not just for me, for the others. That evening, after the marshal left, they planned the operation with the precision of a military campaign. Eliza would go down to Cedar Ridge the next day. She would approach Thomas Kane, claiming she had been lost in the storm and had only just found her way to town. Thatcher would resume his role as the mountain hermit, but he would make regular, seemingly random trips to town for supplies, allowing him to gather intelligence and act as a lookout. He'll be suspicious, Eliza warned. A man like Thomas Kane didn't get this far by being a fool. Let him be suspicious, Thatcher said. Suspicious men make mistakes. Doc Ida would be their vital communication link, carrying coded messages back and forth during her medical rounds. Marshal Davies and his men would remain hidden at her remote homestead, coordinating with federal resources and waiting for the signal to move in. One more thing, Davies had said just before he left, his words casting a dark shadow over their careful plans. We have reason to believe the operation is preparing to pack up and move. They're drawing too much attention. Too many questions are being asked. If Kane decides to cut his losses and disappear. He didn't have to finish the sentence. They all knew what it meant. The women, the evidence, would become liabilities. Liabilities to be eliminated. How long do we have? Eliza had asked. Weeks, Davies replied. Maybe less. Now sitting by the fire, the comfortable silence they had built was gone, replaced by a crackling, high-stakes tension. I never wanted to care about someone again, Thatcher confessed into the quiet, his voice raw. I know, she whispered. Sarah, she died because I made a mistake. I lost control of the wagon on a turn I'd taken 100 times before. That wasn't your fault, Thatcher. It was an accident. It felt like my fault. For 15 years, it's felt like my fault. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in her dark, intelligent eyes. Now I'm terrified I'll make another mistake. That I'll lose you, too. You won't lose me, she said, her voice full of a certainty he desperately wanted to believe. We're partners, remember? Partners. The word carried a different weight now. It had grown into something deeper, something more profound, something neither of them dared to name, but both of them recognized with every beat of their hearts. When this is over, Eliza said carefully, her gaze locked on his. What happens then? I don't know, he admitted honestly. What do you want to happen? Her answer was immediate, as if she'd been holding it in for days. I want to stay here, on this mountain, with you. I want to help you teach again. I want to build something good out of all this ugliness. Thatcher's chest felt like it was going to burst, a painful, terrifying mixture of hope and fear. And if Thomas Kane wins? He asked, forcing the words out. If the operation vanishes and takes you with it? Then you'll find me, she said with unshakable confidence. I know you will. How can you be so certain? Because you're not the broken man who ran up this mountain 15 years ago, she said, her voice soft but strong. You're the man who stood up to 6 armed riders to protect a total stranger. You're the man who chose justice over safety. You're the man who came back to life. Outside, the deep darkness of the mountain night settled over the valley. Tomorrow would bring deception, danger, and the constant chilling threat of discovery. But tonight, in the small, warm cabin, two people who had found each other by accident held on to the fragile hope that love and courage might just be enough to triumph over fear. "Promise me something," Thatcher said, his voice thick with emotion. "Anything. Promise me you'll come back to this mountain, whatever happens. Find your way back to me." "I promise," she whispered. The fire burned down to glowing embers as they made their final preparations. By dawn, Eliza would walk back down the mountain and into a carefully laid trap. Thatcher would resume his lonely watch, a ghost in the high peaks, guarding the woman he loved from a distance. Neither of them slept much that night. Both of them knew far too much about how quickly and how irrevocably everything could change. Eliza Mayfield walked into Thomas Kane's general store with her head held high, the fraudulent marriage contract clutched in her gloved hand like a shield. The man behind the counter looked nothing like the monster she had imagined. He was short and soft, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his waistcoat. But his eyes were cold and calculating, like a snake's, and they assessed her not as a person, but as a piece of livestock at auction. "So," he said, his voice a smug, oily drawl, "you finally decided to honor your obligations." "I was lost," Eliza said, her voice a perfect blend of weary and apologetic. "The storm came up so fast, I took shelter with a mountain man until the roads cleared." Thomas Kane's face darkened instantly. "What mountain man?" "Thatcher, I think he said his name was. A strange, quiet fellow. Lives alone in a cabin up on the peak." "You stayed with Thatcher Kane for a week?" he hissed, his suspicion palpable. "He barely spoke 2 words to me," Eliza lied smoothly. "Just gave me a corner by his fire and left me alone. I came to town as soon as the path was clear." Thomas seemed to relax, but only slightly. The suspicion still lingered in his beady eyes. "Well, you're here now, and we have business to discuss." He led her into a cramped, dusty back room, filled from floor to ceiling with ledgers, files, and stacks of paperwork. Eliza's legally trained eye took it all in at a glance. This was no simple shopkeeper's office. This was the nerve center of a sophisticated operation. Multiple sets of books, correspondence files sorted by territory. "Your contract," Thomas began, settling behind his large, imposing desk, "includes certain provisions, penalty clauses for delayed arrival." "I couldn't control the weather," she protested weakly, playing her part. "Nevertheless," he said, pushing a new document across the desk toward her, a list of neatly penned figures. "You have now incurred additional fees, room and board during your delay, administrative costs for the trouble you've caused." Eliza pretended to study the exorbitant figures. In reality, she was committing every detail of the room to memory. The location of the safe in the corner, the specific labels on the filing cabinets. Marshall Davies had trained her well. "These numbers, they seem excessive," she stammered. "That's the contract you signed," he sneered. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to work off your debt through other arrangements." The threat in his voice was as cold and sharp as a razor. Eliza forced herself to look frightened, to shrink back in her chair, hiding the wave of pure disgust that washed over her. "What kind of arrangements?" she whispered. "I have business associates," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Men in the mining camps, on remote ranches. They often have need of domestic help, temporary positions, of course, until your debt is fully satisfied." "How temporary?" "Depends entirely on how cooperative you are." Over the next week, Thomas Kane kept her on a short leash. She swept the floors of his store, organized his stock, and served his customers, all under his constant, watchful eye. And she listened. She listened to every whispered conversation, every coded remark, every name that was dropped. The pattern became sickeningly clear. Thomas Kane was the local hub for a massive, territory-wide human trafficking ring. Women lured west with the promise of marriage arrived to find themselves ensnared by fraudulent contracts and crippling debt. Those who fought back, who resisted, were sold off to work opportunities in remote locations, slavery in all but name. Sheriff Clayton came into the store twice during that first week. Both times he and Thomas huddled in the back room, speaking in low, urgent tones about merchandise shipments in transport arrangements. Both times Eliza made herself invisible, dusting shelves nearby, memorizing every single word she could overhear. The federal interest is getting stronger, she heard Clayton mutter during his second visit, his voice tight with worry. Word from up the line is it might be time to clean house. How clean? Thomas asked. Clean enough that nobody's left who can testify about anything. Eliza's blood ran cold. Clean house. It could only mean one thing: eliminating the witnesses. The women. All of them. That evening, Doc Ida came into the store to buy liniment, complaining about her arthritis. As she paid, she pressed a coin into Eliza's palm. Eliza pressed back, leaving a tiny folded scrap of paper in the older woman's hand. On it were 3 words. Moving soon. Hurry. Doc Ida's eyes flickered with understanding for a fraction of a second, but her folksy demeanor never wavered. You take care now, Mr. Kane, she said loudly as she left. This mountain air can be mighty hard on the lungs. 2 days later, the endgame began. Thatcher appeared in town, his wagon loaded for a long trip. His cover story was that he was heading into the deep wilderness to trap for the season and needed to stock up. His sudden appearance drew curious stares, but no real suspicion. Who would ever imagine the legendary Hermit of Cedar Ridge was a key player in a federal sting operation? He moved through the town with a slow, methodical deliberation. He visited the smithy, the dry goods store, the saloon. To any casual observer, he was simply a man unused to civilization, awkward and out of his element. In reality, he was positioning his assets, mapping out the town, coordinating with the hidden federal agents. As Eliza helped him load a sack of flour into his wagon in front of Kane's store, he leaned in close, pretending to adjust the ropes. Tonight, he murmured, his voice so low it was barely a breath. Be ready. That evening, Thomas Kane made his first and final mistake. Convinced he was about to make a clean getaway, he gathered all of his incriminating records. He pulled out the hidden ledgers, the files full of names and dates and financial transactions, the damning correspondence that laid out the entire criminal network from Utah to California. He was preparing to burn it all. He also gathered the women. There were 4 others besides Eliza, all trapped in the same nightmare, their faces pale with terror. They were all scheduled for transport to a remote mining camp in the morning. Pack light, Thomas instructed them, his voice cold and final. You won't be needing much where you're going. At precisely midnight, as Kane was feeding his precious records into the pot-bellied stove, Marshal Davies and his men struck. The strike was silent, swift, and overwhelming. Federal agents materialized from the shadows, surrounding the building, blocking every possible exit. While they secured the perimeter, Thatcher and Eliza burst into the back room. Years of legal training took over. They worked with a seamless, unspoken efficiency, their hands flying as they sorted through the mountain of paperwork Kane had been about to destroy. Financial records here, Eliza called softly, grabbing a stack of ledgers. Cross-referenced by victim name and territory. Correspondence with law enforcement, Thatcher added, his hands closing around a file containing explicit payment schedules and signed receipts from Sheriff Clayton. Thomas Kane, realizing what was happening, made a desperate dash for the back door, only to run straight into the arms of 2 grim-faced federal marshals. Sheriff Clayton, responding to a prearranged signal from Kane about a disturbance, arrived with 2 of his deputies, expecting to play the hero. He found himself staring down the barrels of a half-dozen federal rifles. Clayton Matthews, Marshal Davies announced, his voice ringing out in the cold night air. You are under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, and violation of federal interstate commerce laws. The sheriff's face went slack with shock, his complexion turning a pasty white. I don't know what you're talking about. We have documented evidence of the bribes you accepted, Davies continued, his voice like iron. We have your signature on falsified legal documents, and we have testimony from multiple witnesses. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a federal prison, Thomas Kane crumbled within the hour. He gave up the names, the locations, the entire structure of the broader criminal network. The operation collapsed like a house of cards. By dawn, arrests were being made across 4 territories. 17 women, including the 6 who had been missing, were freed from various forms of bondage. They were alive, traumatized, but alive. As the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, Eliza stood in the now silent general store, watching the federal agents meticulously cataloging the evidence of Thomas Kane's monstrous crimes. Her own fake marriage contract lay on the floor, torn into pieces. It was no longer a chain, it was just paper. "It's over," Thatcher said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Is it?" she asked. "The legal part is. Kane, Clayton, and the rest will spend the next few decades in a federal prison." He reached out and took her hand. "But for us." He looked at the woman who had walked into his life by mistake and transformed his world with her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering spirit. "For us," he said, his voice full of a hope he hadn't felt in 15 years, "it's just beginning." 6 months later, Thatcher Kane stood before a classroom for the first time in over 15 years. The room was filled with the bright, curious faces of 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16. The brand new Cedar Ridge schoolhouse, built with a combination of community labor and federal reward money, smelled of fresh pine sawdust and chalk dust. "Today," he announced, his voice steady and strong, no longer hoarse from disuse, "we are going to learn about the Constitution of the United States." Behind him, Eliza was arranging books on the newly built shelves that lined the walls. The town library had been her idea, a place where every child in Cedar Ridge could have access to literature, mathematics, and history, regardless of their family's ability to pay. "Mr. Kane," asked little Sally Morrison, old Pete the blacksmith's granddaughter, "is it true you lived all alone on that mountain for 15 years? "It is," he said with a small smile. "Why'd you come back?" Thatcher's eyes found Eliza across the room. She looked up from her books and gave him an encouraging smile that made his heart swell. "Because sometimes," he said, turning back to the children, "the best way to heal ourselves is by helping others." The answer seemed to satisfy the children, who turned their attention back to their slates. But the real truth was far more complex and far more beautiful than any simple explanation could ever capture. After school, they walked home together, up the familiar mountain path. The cabin had changed. It was no longer a hermit's stark retreat. It was a home. Bright curtains, sewn by Eliza, framed the windows. Books lay open on every surface, and the scent of her cooking had permanently replaced the lonely smell of cold wood smoke and solitude. "Doc Ida stopped by while you were teaching," Eliza said as they climbed the final rise. "She had news from Marshall Davies." "Good news or bad?" "The best. The last of the trafficking network was arrested in California this morning. 43 women have been freed in total. And the missing ones. They've all been found, alive. Some are returning to families they thought they'd never see again. Others are starting new lives with help from the Marshal Service." They reached the cabin just as the sun was touching the tops of the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The view from their porch stretched all the way across the valley to Cedar Ridge below, where the first warm yellow lamplights were beginning to flicker in the windows. "I used to think this mountain was my prison," Thatcher said, settling into the rocking chair that was now his. Eliza sat in Sarah's chair beside him, which was now hers. "And what do you think it is now?" "Home," he said. The simple word was heavy with the weight of everything they had been through, earned through months of shared struggle, shared danger, and shared discovery. They had built something real here, something that honored both the ghosts of their past and their brightest hopes for the future. Eliza unfolded a letter that had arrived on the morning stage. "The territorial governor wants to meet with us next month," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. "He's heard about our school. He wants to talk about establishing literacy programs in other remote communities." She looked at him. "Interested?" "Are you?" he countered. He considered it. 6 months ago, the very thought of leaving his mountain sanctuary would have filled him with paralyzing anxiety. Now it represented an opportunity, a chance to help others just as they had been helped. "We could make a real difference," he said. "We already are," she corrected him gently. And she was right. Their little school was already changing lives. The library was a beacon of knowledge for families scattered for miles across the rugged territory. Other small communities had already begun writing to them, asking for advice on how to start their own programs. Sarah would have loved this, Thatcher said quietly. Tell me about her, Eliza prompted. It had taken him months to be able to speak of his first wife without being crushed by the weight of his guilt. But Eliza's patient, unwavering understanding had been a gentle balm on that old, festering wound. Sarah's memory no longer brought him pain, but a quiet, gentle gratitude for a love he had been lucky enough to know, however briefly. She believed that education could change the world, he said, his voice soft with memory, one student at a time. She was right, Eliza said, and she would have liked you. You both have this incredible ability to see possibility where other people only see problems. Eliza reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand. The simple, familiar contact still sent a jolt of warmth through him, a constant, amazing reminder that this was real, that she was real. I never, ever expected to be this happy, she admitted, her voice a near whisper. Neither did I, he confessed. They had been married 3 months earlier, in a simple ceremony on the porch, performed by Doc Ida, who it turned out had been ordained years ago to serve her scattered flock. No contracts, no penalty clauses, no legal obligations had bound them together. Only a choice freely made and freely renewed every single day. Inside the warm cabin, Eliza began to prepare their dinner, while Thatcher reviewed the next day's lessons. The simple domestic routine felt as natural as breathing, though he still occasionally found himself marveling at the simple, wonderful sound of another person moving through his space. The Harrison boy is still struggling with his mathematics, he observed. His father lost his job when Kane's store closed down. The whole family is under a lot of pressure. Maybe we could arrange some extra tutoring, Eliza suggested, not missing a beat. I could help his sister with her reading while you work with him on his numbers. This was how they operated now. A partnership in all things. Two minds, two hearts, working together toward common goals, each of them contributing their unique strengths to their shared challenges. After dinner, they sat by the fire, as had become their ritual. Eliza worked on correspondence with the other communities seeking their help. Thatcher wrote in a new journal, part personal record, part professional reflection on their evolving teaching methods. Any regrets? She asked suddenly, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. About what? Leaving Boston, coming all this way west, ending up trapped in a human trafficking scheme that accidentally led you to a crazy hermit on a mountain. Thatcher set down his pen and looked at her. Really looked at her. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes and the quiet, unshakable strength that had captivated him from the very first moment. Eliza, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that still felt new and overwhelming. That trafficking scheme brought me the best thing that ever happened to me. Even better than your first marriage? She asked softly. Different, he said after a moment's thought. Sarah and I were young. We thought we had forever. You and I. We know how precious time is. We know how quickly everything can be taken away. He reached out and covered her hand with his. So we don't waste it. No, she agreed, her smile radiant. We don't waste a single moment. Outside their windows, the stars began to appear, scattered like diamonds across the black velvet of the mountain sky. Inside, two people who had found each other through a cascade of mistakes and circumstances continued to build a life based on purpose, choice, and a love that was stronger than any storm. 15 years of silence had taught Thatcher Kane how to listen, and now finally he had a life worth talking about. If this story of justice, courage, and unexpected love moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming next.